The morning mist clung to the waters of Leyte Gulf like a shroud of anticipation. Admiral William Frederick Halsey Jr. stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS New Jersey, watching the sun pierce through the gray dawn of October 23, 1944. The massive fleet spread across the horizon represented the culmination of America's industrial might. Over 800 vessels bearing down on the Philippines in what would become the largest naval engagement in human history. Halsey gripped the rail tighter as reports filtered in from reconnaissance aircraft. The Japanese combined fleet, once the terror of the Pacific, was making its final desperate gambit. Emperor Hirohito's naval forces, commanded by Admiral Soemuto Yauda, had devised an intricate plan called Shogo-1, a last-ditch effort to destroy the American invasion fleet and prevent the liberation of the Philippines. The stakes couldn't be higher. If successful, Japan might extend the war by years. If they failed, their navy would cease to exist as a fighting force. The American invasion of Leyte had begun smoothly just 3 days earlier. General Douglas MacArthur had dramatically waded ashore, fulfilling his famous promise to return to the Philippines. But intelligence reports now painted a terrifying picture. 3 separate Japanese naval forces were converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions, hoping to catch the Americans in a devastating pincer movement. Admiral Thomas Casson Kincaid commanded the 7th Fleet, responsible for protecting the invasion beaches and supporting ground operations. His force included 6 old battleships, mostly survivors of Pearl Harbor seeking redemption, along with escort carriers and destroyers. Meanwhile, Halsey's 3rd Fleet, built around fast carriers and modern battleships, prowled the waters northeast of the Philippines, hunting for the main Japanese carrier force. The complexity of the approaching battle staggered military planners. According to wartime analysis by the Naval War College, never before had so many ships, aircraft, and sailors converged in a single theater of operations. The Japanese plan required perfect timing and coordination between forces. Separated by hundreds of miles, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would lead the powerful center force through the treacherous San Bernardino Strait, while Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would simultaneously attack through Surigao Strait. Most cunningly, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, built around Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, would serve as bait to lure Halsey's powerful 3rd Fleet away from the invasion beaches. As dawn broke fully across the Pacific, radar operators aboard American ships began detecting the first enemy formations. The stage was set for a battle that would dwarf even the legendary encounters at Midway and the Philippine Sea. Over the next 4 days, more than 200,000 sailors and airmen would clash across for separate engagements, spanning hundreds of miles of ocean. The irony was not lost on veterans aboard the American ships. Many had survived Pearl Harbor, the dark day that had thrust America into this Pacific War. Now, nearly 3 years later, they commanded the mightiest naval force ever assembled, bearing down on an enemy that had once seemed invincible. The transformation was complete. America had evolved from a victim of surprise attack into the dominant naval power on Earth. But the Japanese Navy, though weakened and outnumbered, retained the desperate courage of the cornered. Their sailors knew this battle would likely be their last, and they intended to sell their lives dearly. As morning turned to afternoon on October 23rd, the first shots of the Battle of Leyte Gulf echoed across the tropical waters, beginning for days of naval combat that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific forever. The USS Darter trembled as her diesel engines pushed the submarine through the dark waters. West of Palawan Island, Commander David McClintock peered through the periscope at what appeared to be a mirage. The entire Japanese center force, led by the mighty battleship Yamato, steaming directly toward his position in the pre-dawn darkness of October 23rd. McClintock's hands steadied as he counted the enemy vessels, 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, the most powerful surface force Japan had deployed since the war began. At its head sailed Admiral Kurita's flagship, the heavy cruiser Otago, cutting through the calm seas with deadly purpose. He, submarine captain, knew that this moment would define not just his career, but potentially the entire Pacific campaign. Battle stations torpedo, McClintock whispered into the intercom, his voice barely audible above the submarine's mechanical sounds. The Darter's sister boat, USS Dace, commanded by Commander Bladen Claggett, maintained parallel course just 3,000 yards away. Together, these 2 American submarines were about to announce the opening of the greatest naval battle in history. At 6:32 in the morning, both submarines launched their deadly salvos simultaneously. The Darter's torpedoes struck the Otago with devastating effect, sending Admiral Kurita's flagship to the bottom within minutes. The explosion illuminated the tropical morning like a premature sunrise, and McClintock watched through his periscope as hundreds of Japanese sailors struggled in the oil-slicked waters. Meanwhile, the Dace's torpedoes found their mark on the heavy cruiser Maya, which disappeared beneath the waves in a catastrophic explosion that could be heard for miles. The submarine attacks threw the Japanese formation into chaos. Admiral Kurita, rescued from the sinking Otago by a destroyer, was forced to transfer his flag twice before establishing command aboard the super battleship Yamato. The psychological impact proved as devastating as the physical damage. The Japanese had expected to achieve surprise, but instead found themselves under immediate attack in waters they had considered safe. As reported in contemporaneous U.S. Navy dispatches, the submarine assault marked a crucial turning point in naval warfare tactics. American submarines had evolved from lone wolf raiders into coordinated fleet units, capable of tracking and engaging entire enemy formations. The success at Palawan demonstrated how underwater warfare could shape major surface engagements before the opposing fleets ever came within sight of each other. But Kurita's force pressed on, despite the losses. The admiral understood that turning back now would doom the entire Shogo operation. His remaining ships, including the massive Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, each mounting 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells, weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, continued their advance toward San Bernardino Strait. Meanwhile, Admiral Halsey received the submarine contact reports aboard his flagship with mixed emotions. The intelligence confirmed that a major Japanese force was approaching, but it also presented him with a terrible dilemma. Should he turn south immediately to intercept Kurita's battleships, or continue hunting for the Japanese carrier force that reconnaissance flights had detected to the north? The decision would haunt Halsey for the rest of his life. Convinced that carriers represented the primary threat, and unaware that Ozawa's northern force carried only a handful of aircraft, the American admiral chose to pursue what he believed was the main Japanese fleet. This decision would leave San Bernardino Strait unguarded and set the stage for one of the most controversial moments in American naval history. As October 23rd drew to a close, both fleets maneuvered through the darkness, their commanders wrestling with incomplete intelligence and the fog of war. The submarine attacks had drawn first blood, but the main battle still lay ahead. In the wardrooms and gun turrets of hundreds of ships, sailors from both nations prepared for a confrontation that would test their training, courage, and will to survive. The Pacific Ocean, which had remained relatively quiet since the Battle of the Philippine Sea from months earlier, was about to erupt in the greatest display of naval firepower the world had ever witnessed. The morning of October 24th dawned crystal clear over the Sibian Sea. Perfect flying weather that would soon become a nightmare for Admiral Kurita's center force. At 8:30, radar operators aboard American carriers detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from land bases in the Philippines, signaling the beginning of the air phase of the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Admiral Frederick Sherman's Task Group 38.3 bore the brunt of the initial Japanese air assault. The light carrier USS Princeton, veteran of numerous Pacific campaigns, was maneuvering to launch her morning combat air patrol when a single Japanese dive bomber broke through the defensive screen. The Yokosuka D for wide-duty pilot, likely knowing his mission was suicide, pressed his attack with fanatic determination. The 500-pound bomb struck Princeton's flight deck amidships, penetrating to the hangar bay, where it detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting explosion sent a column of black smoke towering thousands of feet into the tropical sky. Captain William Burker fought desperately to save his ship, but secondary explosions in the torpedo storage area sealed Princeton's fate. Commander Henry Lambert, watching from the nearby cruiser USS Birmingham, later recalled the horror of the scene as his ship moved alongside to assist firefighting efforts. At 15:24 in the afternoon, Princeton's after magazine exploded with such violence that it lifted the carrier's entire stern section into the air. The blast killed more than 400 sailors instantly and wounded hundreds more aboard both ships. While Princeton burned, hundreds of American aircraft from Admiral Mark Mitcher's Fast Carrier Task Force descended upon Kurita's surface ships like angry hornets. The Japanese formation, stretched across miles of open ocean, presented perfect targets for the diving Hellcats, Dauntlesses, and Avengers. The super battleship Musashi, pride of the Japanese fleet and sister ship to the legendary Yamato, became the primary focus of American air attacks. Throughout the day, wave after wave of carrier aircraft struck the massive battleship. Musashi's anti-aircraft guns blazed continuously, their shells creating deadly black puffs across the sky. But the American pilots pressed their attacks with relentless determination, Lieutenant Commander Robert Rira, leading a squadron of torpedo bombers, made multiple runs against the giant warship despite intense defensive fire. The cumulative damage was staggering. By afternoon, Musashi had absorbed more than 40 bomb and torpedo hits, enough punishment to sink any normal warship several times over. Her 18-inch gun turrets, each weighing more than a destroyer, gradually developed ominous lists as flooding spread throughout her hull. Captain Toshihira Inoguchi, commanding the doomed vessel, maintained course and speed as long as possible, determined that his ship would die fighting. As documented in post-war Japanese naval records, the loss of Musashi represented more than just the destruction of a powerful warship. It symbolized the collapse of Japan's maritime strategy. The battleship had been designed to engage enemy capital ships in traditional gun duels, but she was being destroyed by aircraft that could strike from beyond the range of her mighty weapons. At 1935, as the tropical sun began setting over the Sibian Sea, Musashi finally succumbed to her wounds. The massive ship rolled slowly to port, her pagoda-like superstructure disappearing beneath the waves, as more than 1,000 sailors went down with their ship. The sight of the unsinkable battleship's death throes sent shockwaves through both fleets. If American aircraft could destroy the mightiest warship ever built, no ship was safe. Admiral Kurita, aboard the Yamato, made the agonizing decision to reverse course temporarily. His force had suffered crippling losses, Musashi destroyed, several cruisers heavily damaged, and his screening destroyers scattered by repeated air attacks. The admiral needed time to reorganize and assess his remaining strength before continuing toward San Bernardino Strait. But unknown to the Americans, Kurita's withdrawal was only temporary. As darkness fell, the Japanese admiral would turn his battered but still dangerous force back toward their original objective. The loss of Musashi had been devastating, but it had not broken Japanese resolve. The climactic surface action still lay ahead, and it would test the courage of sailors on both sides in ways they had never imagined. The air battles of October 24th had demonstrated American naval aviation's complete dominance, but they had not eliminated the Japanese threat entirely. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf stood in the Combat Information Center of his flagship, USS West Virginia, studying the radar plot with grim satisfaction. At 22:30 on October 24th, the green blips representing Admiral Nishimura's southern force appeared on the screens. Like moths drawn to flame, the Japanese were steaming directly into the most perfectly executed naval ambush in military history. Surigao Strait stretched before them like a deadly gauntlet, its narrow waters providing the perfect killing ground for Oldendorf's carefully positioned battle line. 6 American battleships, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, and Pennsylvania, waited in the darkness, their massive guns trained on the strait's northern exit. Most of these vessels were Pearl Harbor survivors, their crews burning for revenge against the empire that had attacked them without warning. The irony was profound and deliberate. Admiral Kinkaid had specifically assigned these older battleships to Oldendorf precisely because of their Pearl Harbor connection. Tonight, ships that had been caught sleeping at their moorings would exact terrible vengeance on the Japanese fleet. Captain Roscoe Hillencoter, commanding West Virginia, whispered to his gunnery officer, "This is for December 7th, boys." Admiral Nishimura's force, consisting of the battleships Yamashiro and Fuso, the heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, approached through the southern entrance completely unaware of the trap awaiting them. The Japanese admiral believed he was executing a coordinated pincer attack alongside Admiral Kurita's center force, not knowing that Kurita had been delayed by the day's air battles. It would not arrive until hours later. The first phase of destruction began at 20-3-0-9 when American torpedo boats attacked from concealment along the straits. Shoreline PT boats, their crews consisting largely of reservists and volunteers, raced through the darkness launching torpedoes at point-blank range. Lieutenant Robert Leeson's PT-137 scored the first hit, sending a torpedo into the destroyer Fuso's hull with devastating effect. Following the torpedo boat attacks, American destroyers entered the fray with characteristic aggressiveness. Captain Jesse Coward's destroyer squadron 54 charged down the strait in column formation, their 5-inch guns blazing as they launched torpedo spreads at the advancing Japanese line. The destroyer USS Melvin scored multiple hits on the battleship Fuso, causing massive explosions that split the ancient warship in two. As recorded in the official U.S. Navy battle reports, the coordination between American units reached unprecedented levels of precision. Radar-controlled gunfire, perfected through months of practice, allowed American ships to engage targets they could not even see with devastating accuracy. Japanese, lacking comparable radar technology, found themselves fighting blind against an enemy who could track their every movement. At 0-3-50-1 on October 25th, Admiral Oldendorf gave the order that Pearl Harbor survivors had dreamed of hearing. Commence firing. The 6 American battleships opened simultaneously, their muzzle flashes lighting up the tropical night like lightning strikes. West Virginia's 16-inch guns hurled their massive shells across 12 miles of dark water, striking the Japanese flagship Yamashiro with pinpoint accuracy. The carnage was immediate and overwhelming. Yamashiro, already damaged by torpedo attacks, staggered under the concentrated fire of 6 battleships. Her ancient armor, designed for an earlier era of naval warfare, could not withstand the modern American shells that rained down upon her. Within minutes, Admiral Nishimura's flagship was a blazing wreck. Her superstructure collapsed and her magazines cooking off in secondary explosions. The heavy cruiser Mogami, attempting to escape the slaughter, ran directly into the guns of American cruisers positioned at the strait's flanks. USS Portland and USS Louisville pounded the Japanese vessel with 8-inch shells, reducing her to a floating inferno. Only one Japanese destroyer, Shiger, managed to escape the massacre, carrying news of the catastrophe back to fleet headquarters. By dawn on October 25th, Admiral Nishimura's entire force had been annihilated. The Southern force's destruction was so complete that it would be remembered as the last traditional battleship engagement in naval history, a final, decisive demonstration of American naval supremacy. But even as Oldendorf's crew celebrated their overwhelming victory, urgent radio messages warned of a new threat approaching from the north. Admiral Kurita had reformed his center force and was racing toward the vulnerable invasion beaches, where only a thin screen of escort carriers stood between the Japanese battleships and MacArthur's landing force. The night of perfect vengeance was ending, but the greatest test of American courage still lay ahead. Dawn broke gray and ominous over the waters east of Samar Island on October 25th. Aboard the escort carrier USS St. Lo, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague sipped his morning coffee while reviewing routine patrol assignments for what he expected to be another quiet day supporting ground operations. The small escort carriers of Taffy 3, St. Lo, Fanshawe Bay, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkin Bay, and Gambier Bay had been providing close air support for the light invasion. Their slow, lightly armed vessels never intended for fleet action. At 0-6-40-5, everything changed in an instant. Lookouts aboard the destroyer USS Hull reported massive pagoda masts on the northern horizon, and within minutes the impossible became terrifyingly real. Admiral Kurita's center force, led by the super battleship Yamato, was bearing down on the helpless escort carriers at full speed, their 18-inch guns already belching smoke and flame. Holy Christ, where did they come from? Sprague's stunned exclamation, recorded in the ship's log, captured the shock reverberating through every American vessel. The Japanese had achieved complete tactical surprise, emerging from San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness while Admiral Halsey chased phantom carriers hundreds of miles to the north. Now for Japanese battleships, 8 cruisers and 11 destroyers were racing toward the invasion beaches with only Sprague's tiny force standing in their way. The odds were hopeless beyond calculation. Kurita's ships mounted guns that outranged anything the Americans possessed, and their armor could shrug off the escort carrier's 5-inch guns like raindrops. Logic dictated immediate surrender or flight, but Admiral Sprague possessed neither option. Behind him lay the invasion beaches, where thousands of American soldiers depended on his protection. Retreat was impossible. Survival was unlikely. Victory seemed inconceivable. Small boys, attack. Sprague's order sent the 3 destroyers and for destroyer escorts of his screen charging directly at the Japanese battle line in what military historians would later call the most gallant naval action in American history. Commander Amos Hathaway aboard USS Heermann led the suicidal charge, his small ship racing toward the massive Yamato like David confronting Goliath. The destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, exemplified the desperate courage of that morning. Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma who had vowed to fight like hell against any enemy, drove his ship directly at the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano. Johnston's 5-inch guns, designed for anti-aircraft work, hammered away at the cruiser's superstructure while Evans maneuvered to launch his torpedo spread at point-blank range. According to contemporaneous reports from the Naval Historical Center, the ferocity of the American destroyer attack stunned the Japanese commanders. Admiral Kurita, expecting to catch helpless transports and cargo vessels, instead found himself engaged by warships whose crews fought with reckless abandon. The psychological impact proved as significant as the physical damage the Japanese began to suspect. They had stumbled into a trap. Meanwhile, the escort carriers turned south and increased speed, their flight decks launching every available aircraft. In a desperate attempt to slow the Japanese advance, pilots found themselves attacking with whatever weapons they carried: bombs intended for ground support, depth charges meant for submarines, even empty aircraft making dummy runs to distract enemy gunners. Lieutenant Paul Garrison, flying from USS Kitchen Bay, made 16 attack runs against Japanese ships despite having exhausted his ammunition after the third pass. The battle devolved into a running gun fight across the tropical seas. USS Gambier Bay, slowest of the escort carriers, gradually fell behind the formation as Japanese shells bracketed her flight deck. At 0820, an 8-inch shell from the cruiser Chikuma struck the carrier's engine room, reducing her speed to dead slow. Captain Walter Vuke fought to save his ship, but concentrated enemy fire was turning Gambier Bay into a blazing wreck. As the morning progressed, the heroism of individual Americans began to tip the scales of battle. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, nicknamed the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, charged directly at the Japanese battle line despite being outgunned by ratios of 10-1. Commander Robert Copeland's tiny vessel engaged the cruiser Chikai at such close range that the Japanese guns could not depress sufficiently to return effective fire. The climax came when Admiral Kurita, observing the ferocious American resistance and confused by contradictory reports from his subordinates, made a decision that would haunt him forever. At 0-9-20-5, just as victory seemed within his grasp, the Japanese admiral ordered his fleet to break off the engagement and retire northward. The most powerful naval force Japan had deployed since the war began was retreating from a handful of escort carriers and their gallant escorts. The waters north of Cape Ingao sparkled under the afternoon sun of October 25th, as Admiral William House's Third Fleet finally caught sight of its quarry. After hours of frustrating pursuit, the American fast carriers had located Admiral Ozawa's northern force, the bait that had successfully lured them away from the critical action off Samar. Now, with 4 Japanese aircraft carriers spread across the horizon, House intended to complete the destruction of the Imperial Navy's once mighty carrier arm. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, the carrier Zuikaku, watching the approaching American air armadas with the fatalistic calm of a samurai accepting death. His force consisted of 4 carriers Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitos, and Chiyoda, but they carried fewer than 80 aircraft between them. The experienced pilots, who had once made the Japanese carrier force invincible, lay dead on the bottom of the Pacific, victims of 2 years of attrition warfare. Ozawa understood perfectly that his ships were sacrificial pawns in Admiral Toyoda's desperate gamble. The Northern Force's mission was not to win a battle, but to die conspicuously, drawing House's powerful Third Fleet away from the invasion beaches, where Kurita's battleships could destroy the American landing force. In this respect, the Japanese admiral had succeeded brilliantly, but success came at the price of his entire command. The first American strike launched at dawn. 300 aircraft rising from the flight decks of Essex, Lexington, Franklin, and Intrepid. Commander David McCampbell, the Navy's leading ace, led his fighter squadron toward the Japanese carriers with grim determination. The irony was not lost on the American pilots. They were about to destroy the last operational remnants of the carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. The explosion ignited aviation gasoline stored in the hangar bay, sending pillars of orange flame shooting hundreds of feet into the air. Within minutes, the light carrier was dead in the water, her crew abandoning ship as secondary explosions racked her hull. The carrier Chiyoda suffered a similar fate under the concentrated attack of dive bombers from USS Franklin, as documented in post-war Japanese records. The ship's damage control parties fought heroically to save their vessel, but the cumulative damage proved overwhelming. Captain Jiro Sato ordered abandoned ship at 14:30, saluting his flag as the carrier settled beneath the waves. Admiral Ozawa transferred his flag from the sinking Zuikaku to the cruiser Oyoto, as American aircraft swarmed over his remaining ships like vengeful spirits. Her experienced crew, among the last trained carrier sailors in the Japanese Navy, fought their ship with skill born of desperation, but numbers and training told the inevitable story. Wave after wave of American aircraft struck the Japanese formation, their attacks coordinated with a precision that reflected months of training and combat experience. The light carrier's WWII, attempting to escape through a rain squall, emerged to find herself bracketed by dive bombers from USS Essex. Commander William Dean's attack group pounded the small carrier until she rolled over and sank, taking most of her crew with her. By late afternoon, Admiral Halsey faced a difficult decision aboard his flagship USS New Jersey. Radio intercepts indicated that Admiral Kurita's center force had engaged the escort carriers off Samar, and urgent messages from Admiral Kincaid pleaded for immediate assistance. The destruction of Ozawa's carriers was nearly complete, but American soldiers and sailors were dying hundreds of miles to the south while the Third Fleet pursued what were essentially empty hulks. Admiral Robert Carney, Halsey's chief of staff, argued forcefully for an immediate turn south to engage Kurita's retreating battleships. The opportunity to trap the Japanese center force and complete its destruction might never come again. But Halsey, his blood up from the carrier battle, was reluctant to abandon the pursuit when victory seemed so close at hand. The final act came at sunset when Zuikaku, the last operational Japanese fleet carrier, finally succumbed to her wounds. The ship that had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor rolled slowly to port, her battle flag still flying proudly from her mainmast. Admiral Ozawa, watching from his cruiser, saluted as his former flagship disappeared beneath the darkening waters. With Zuikaku sinking, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier force ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. The Northern Force had accomplished its mission of decoying Halsey away from the invasion beaches, but the cost had been total annihilation. As night fell over the Philippine Sea, the greatest naval battle in history was drawing to its close, leaving behind a changed Pacific where American naval supremacy was absolute and undisputed. The tropical twilight of October 26th cast long shadows across Leyte Gulf, as Admiral Kincaid's staff tallied the staggering cost of the greatest naval battle in human history. For days of continuous combat had transformed the strategic balance of the Pacific, but victory had come at a price measured in thousands of lives and dozens of ships scattered across the ocean floor. The numbers told a story of American triumph that surpassed even the most optimistic pre-battle projections. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost for aircraft carriers 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, more than 2/3 of the combined fleet that had sortied from Japanese waters. Just 1 week earlier, Admiral Toyoda's desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion force had instead resulted in the virtual elimination of Japan's remaining naval power. American losses, while significant, paled in comparison to the Japanese catastrophe. The light carrier USS Princeton, sunk by a lone Japanese dive bomber, represented the only major American warship lost during the 4-day battle. Several destroyers and destroyer escorts had been sunk during the gallant action off Samar, but their crews had died knowing their sacrifice had saved the invasion fleet from annihilation. Captain Robert Copeland, survivor of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, later wrote in his action report that the men who died off Samar had fought their ships like battleships and died like heroes. The small vessel's crew had engaged Japanese cruisers at point-blank range, trading their lives to buy precious time for the escort carriers to escape. Their courage epitomized the spirit that had carried America from the ashes of Pearl Harbor to absolute victory in the Pacific. The strategic implications of the Battle of Leyte Gulf extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's merchant marine, already crippled by submarine warfare, would now face completely uncontested American air and sea power. The home islands were effectively cut off from the resources of Southeast Asia, dooming Japan's war economy to rapid collapse. As noted in classified strategic bombing survey reports, the battle marked the point where Japan's defeat became mathematically inevitable. Admiral Kurita's decision to break off his attack on the escort carriers would generate controversy for decades among military historians. With victory within his grasp, the Japanese commander had turned away from the most important target of the entire operation. Whether motivated by confusion, caution, or simply the shock of encountering such fierce resistance, Kurita's withdrawal had saved the American invasion force from potential disaster. The human cost of the battle resonated through families across both nations. More than 12,000 Japanese sailors had died during the 4-day engagement, many going down with their ships in the tradition of the Imperial Navy. American casualties, while lower, still represented hundreds of young men who would never see home again. In small towns from Oklahoma to Oregon, families would soon receive telegrams beginning with the dreaded words, "We regret to inform you." General MacArthur, waiting ashore at Leyte to fulfill his famous promise, understood that the naval battle had secured not just the Philippines, but the entire Pacific campaign. Without control of the sea lanes, Japan could neither reinforce its island garrisons nor evacuate them when American forces arrived. The island-hopping campaign that would carry the war to Japan's doorstep was now assured of success, as documented in contemporary Marine Corps records. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders throughout the Pacific proved as devastating as the material losses. News of the combined fleet's destruction spread quickly through the far-flung island garrisons, carrying with it the realization that no help would come from the homeland. Morale, already strained by months of bombing and isolation, began to crumble as soldiers and sailors grasped the full implications of their abandonment. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had lasted for days and covered more than 100,000 square miles of ocean. When the guns finally fell silent and the last aircraft landed on their carriers, the Pacific War had been decided. Japan might fight on for months with characteristic determination, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. American naval supremacy was now absolute, and with it came the power to dictate the terms and timing of Japan's inevitable surrender. In the years that followed, historians would debate tactics, criticize decisions, and analyze the battle's countless what-ifs. But for the sailors who fought in those waters, the meaning was simple and profound. They had participated in the decisive naval engagement of the 20th century, and their victory had brought the long war one crucial step closer to its end. The Pacific belonged to America now, and the road to Tokyo Bay lay open before the advancing fleets.